Chris Lee of Southeastern 14 alongside Blake Lovell. We are a couple days out from Christmas. The regular season is about to start. Blake, it's going to be a fun time in the SEC. Let's start here. We have been through several permutations of our power rankings in basketball. We started with Auburn, number 1. We switched to Florida for a brief spell. I think we went back to Alabama. I know Kentucky is a team that you've thought at times might be the best team in the league. Tennessee's got an argument. Now we've got LSU, who I think topped our power rankings last week, the best team, or really the only undefeated team left in the league. But now we've got Auburn back in the discussion here. Alan Flanagan is back. The Tigers looking good for a multitude of reasons. Let's start here. Who's the best team in the SEC right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, your argument's going to come down to LSU and Auburn. I think that's probably it. And I know Tennessee will probably look at that and say, well, we just beat Arizona, and that's a huge win. So you have to throw Tennessee probably right in there, but I probably would start the conversation with LSU and Auburn just because of what I've seen from them. But again, that's not going to take anything away from Tennessee, whose only 2 losses are to Villanova and Texas Tech. Those aren't exactly bad losses by any means. One of those in overtime, and then again, you have beaten in Arizona. They just throttled North Carolina, which we've seen other teams do like Kentucky, but. I think that I would start there. I think it's a pretty close race, probably between those 3. I would still put Auburn and LSU ahead, maybe right now, but it is very, very close. I mean, it's, take your pick. I mean, LSU is the best defensive team in the country. We would have never said that. We've never even considered that, 2 months ago when we were preparing for the season. We would have never mentioned that in the same category. LSU, best defensive team. But they are, and that's been the difference. And, I know this is the time where, trust me, I understand. You look at social media, everyone wants to compare schedules and compare wins and all that. And it makes sense. I understand why you do it. But at the end of the day, LSU's beaten every team they've played. And for the most part, they've done it convincingly. And again, they have done it by being the best defensive team in the country. So I think they have an argument for that spot. But now that Auburn's back at full strength with Alan Flanagan, I think they certainly have that argument. They're a double overtime loss away from being undefeated themselves. And when you look at their schedule, they've beaten some quality competition. Maybe they don't have an Arizona win on their resume like Tennessee does, but they've still, beaten some quality teams. And so, there's a lot of good teams. And I think especially at the top right now, we're seeing what some of these teams can do. And with Auburn, with Flanagan back, we have this conversation now. Auburn and LSU play each other to open up SEC play next Wednesday. And so that will give us a much better idea maybe of how those 2 teams match up in particular. But I think there's a pretty good argument for those 3 teams. And, don't forget about Kentucky. And I think Alabama's had their issues. You'd put them a little behind right now, but it's not like you think Alabama's just going to fall off and not have a chance to be right there at some point soon.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because there's 5 or 6 at least really good teams in this league. But back to Auburn, we could argue LSU or Auburn at this point for various reasons. Like you said, LSU is the only unbeaten team, and maybe that breaks the tie right now. Frankly, that's irrelevant. Teams are figuring out who they are. They're getting players back. Auburn's got Alan Flanagan back, who might have been the running for preseason player of the year in this league had he been healthy. But I think if you look at completeness, Blake, this is a guard-dominated era. But you look at what Auburn's got underneath with Kessler and Smith. And Kessler was my wild card player of the year coming into the season in this league because he was a McDonald's All-American, but he really didn't flash the offensive skills in bulk that he was capable of at North Carolina last year and really has not set the world on fire scoring, but he's had, I don't know how many it is, 3 or 4 block games in a row. He swats 7 last night against Murray State. Smith gets 3 on his own, so that's 10 between your big guys. And by the way, Jabari Smith may be the number 1 player in the draft next year. So you talk about a massive talent. That guy may be where we start the discussion in this league. But, then Auburn's got Wendell Green Jr., who hit a phenomenal shot last night in just a weird circumstance that's made all the highlight films. You got Flanagan. I just look at this team from guards to bigs to depth, and I think the importance of bigs, too. Sometimes you hit spots, and Auburn is going to be an outstanding offensive team, but some nights your shots aren't going to fall. And Bruce Pearl's teams hit a lot of threes. What I think I really like about them, among other things, and when you've got two erasers in the paint like they've got with Smith and Kessler, it just makes easy buckets hard to come by. And that's why I'm really bullish, among many things, on this team long term.
Yeah, and I mean, Bruce Pearl knows how to get the best out of his talent. Let's call it what it is. I mean, he's one of the best in the country at that. And whether anyone wants to give him credit for it or not, I mean, yes, it's great, to recruit the 4-star and 5-star talent. But if they come in and they don't leave any better than they were, when they stepped onto campus, then that's, what does that say? But I think if you go back and look through the years, his Auburn teams, his Tennessee teams, you can probably even go back to the Milwaukee teams and all that. Find me a lot of players that did not grow as basketball players, or at least he got the best out of them in the system that they were in. And I think that is something that he probably still doesn't get enough credit for. And really one of his biggest strengths and keys to his success probably at various stops is he knows how to put guys in the right place. And it just seems like, once again, we're seeing that with this team. He's found a way to put Green into the right position to have success. He's found a way to develop Kessler now into, having 3 really good games in a row here. He's found a way to get that extra something out of Jabari Smith to where he looks like the number 1 pick in the NBA draft. These are all things that add up. And I think that is why Auburn has become, the type of program that they become, is because every single season, whether it's this team, whether it's Jared Harper, Bryce Brown, Samir Dowdy, go back to all those different teams, whoever it is, for the most part, I don't think you're going to find a lot of players that left Auburn worse than they were when they came in. I think most of them, the majority, and I'm sure someone will find an example, but the majority have left significantly better players, or have gone on to be. I mean, look at Jumo Kiki, right? Like, he was someone that came in very, very heralded player, but man, like, he became a lottery pick or somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly where he was drafted, but it's like those are the kind of things that you see, and that's what I think can make Auburn successful with this specific team. Is you're seeing the development of all of these guys. And it even goes back to last year with the development of an Alan Flanagan and Jalen Williams and guys like that. Now it pays off this season with these other guys around them. So that's a big part of their success. And it should be fun, I think, in that opener next week against LSU.
Well, and another one, too, last year, they developed JT Thor into a one and done, too. I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking, I'm sure if we thought long enough, we could name someone, but they're bringing in better players consistently than they brought in probably in the history of Auburn basketball. And I'm having a hard time identifying places where they've really missed on an evaluation or a development with a really renowned prospect.
And I've always said this, it doesn't matter if it's Auburn, it doesn't matter what name is on the jersey. I think recruiting rankings sometimes, I'm not saying they're overrated, but it's one thing to recruit a 5-star player and to have him perform as a 5-star player for 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, whatever, versus, just recruiting a 5-star player, right? And he comes in and maybe he's not a 5-star in college, if that makes sense. So I think that is something where you look at the most successful coaches, it's never about, who's number one in the recruiting rankings all the time. It's who can get the most out of the recruiters, out of the players that they recruit. And I think Bruce Pearl is one of the best in the country at that, no matter whether it's a 5-star, a 3-star, whatever. Again, you can go back to his Tennessee days. Pick a lot of guys from that Tennessee. I mean, Dane Bradshaw, guys like that. You can go up and down the list. I mean, that's what they do, and their system works. How they approach things just works, and I think there's something to that, and that's led to a lot of their success.
Okay, we can't have the discussion of SEC big men without mentioning this guy. Oscar Schwebway at Kentucky has been unbelievable. He gets 28 rebounds last night in a blowout win over a pretty good Western Kentucky team. But out rebounds Western, who's got a 7'5" big in its own right, who's pretty good, by himself, 28-27, sets a Rupp Arena record for rebounds. I think it was 23. I could be wrong, but he did this at West Virginia. He's taken it to another level. I had some doubts about Kentucky. You have been steadfast for a month now. Even when they looked a little shaky or things weren't going well, you said, I still think this is an elite team in so many words. My issue with them is they couldn't get Kellen Grady going. That started to happen. This is looking like a really, really good team in its own right. I'll look at one stat from last night, 27 assists. That tells you that offense has started to flow. They get 95 points, again, against a good Western team. Kentucky looks to me, Blake, like a team that's really starting to put it together.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, with Kentucky, I mean, they've lost to a top 5 Duke team, and they've lost a true road game at Notre Dame.
In the final seconds, too, yeah.
And a completely different roster. Like, you're still, at that point, you were 9 games into the season with a completely different roster. And so you're trying to sort of piece all those, put everything together. And, it's your first true road game and really your only true road game in non-conference play. And so, like, it's not that surprising, I think, to see Kentucky. And that's why I think we do this way more often than we do with Kentucky and Duke and Carolina and all. We overreact way more to the teams that are traditionally supposed to be in the top 5 every single year, the top 10, all of this. I think we overreact way more to any time those teams lose games, period, than we do, to the teams that maybe have been up and coming teams that maybe drop a game here or there. I think it's a natural thing because you just expect over a long period of time that these teams are always going to finish at the top. But as we've talked about for, years now, this is just sort of a different era in college basketball to where a lot of other teams can rise to the top, and the Kentuckys, the Dukes, and the Carolinas are going to lose games sometimes. And I think that's where we kind of are with this Kentucky team. No, this isn't. And we said this going into the season, even if we pick Kentucky to be number 1 in the SEC, this is not the John Wall team. This is not the Anthony Davis team. Like, this is just, it's completely different. Like, this is a sort of a different era in Kentucky basketball, and the transfer rule has a lot to do with that. It's one of those things where it's going to take a little bit of time. And like you said, I mean, look at the pieces start to come together. And this is what happens with John Calipari teams is they start to sort of figure some things out in December. You'll see them maybe hit a bump in the road somewhere in January. But then by February, they will probably have a chance to really take it to another level. And I think that's kind of the trajectory that if right now you have to make a prediction, that's kind of what you would expect from this team based on some of these guys that are, playing the way they are. I mean, you talk about Schwebway. I mean, this guy's Wilt Chamberlain. Like, he's just coming out here, just every single rebound is his. And we knew he had that potential. Now, obviously, we weren't going to be predicting 28 rebound games or anything, but we knew at West Virginia when you saw him play that he had the potential, to be just one of the most dominant big men in the entire country. And now that he's sort of becoming the guy where, hey, Kentucky doesn't necessarily have to make every shot or doesn't have to defend perfectly. He's going to probably get the rebound and limit second chance opportunities. And that's kind of what you want to get out of someone like that. But when Grady's scoring, you said it. I mean, that makes them a different team. I still think Severe Wheeler has just been, I mean, look, you can look at the points all you want. You can look at the turnovers, but I still think he is, extremely valuable on this team. And I mean, he's the guy that's handling the ball most of the time, but he's been great. I think he just passes the ball so well, and doesn't have to be someone that just scores all the time. But you can have a game like he had against North Carolina where he can score like that, and really just exploit defenses. So I think they're going to get there. And, right now, if you ask me who's going to be sitting there at the top, I mean, it's hard not to say this Kentucky team will have a really good chance to be there come March, just because I think you're seeing the pieces start to come together.
Well, we're getting into that territory of talking about teams that could be Elite Eight, maybe Final Four teams if everything goes well. And I think that list is obviously Auburn, Kentucky, Alabama. LSU is its own category. We'll get into them later. Tennessee, another one. And let's talk about the Vols. Again, on the topic of big man performances, John Fulkerson did something last night that I didn't think I'd be saying. He kind of carried them to a win. Arizona just said, we're going to make Fulkerson beat us. They gave him isolations at times. That kid delivered, including a really just almost, I'm not going to say impossible play, but a degree of difficulty of about a 9, getting an offensive rebound from where he was on the floor and then getting off a shot to beat the buzzer and getting fouled. On top of that, probably the biggest play of the night in Tennessee's win over Arizona, which now has its first loss of the season, which, of course, came last night in Knoxville. But that's another team that man, you look at them on paper and say, this team's got so many of the pieces. And then you look at the scoreboard some nights when they've really struggled offensively, and you're going, boy, I don't know. But that was a team last night that I thought really put it together in key stretches on both ends of the floor against Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it. I didn't think Tennessee could win games without Kennedy Chandler playing his best. But that's the thing, is you can if you have other guys step up, and kind of saw that with Fulkerson, to where that's what you need. Like, you can't just put everything on Kennedy Chandler all the time, and you have to have more of that balance. And of course, Vescovi's had a good season. He's right there with Chandler in terms of points and stuff, but I still think everything, has kind of gone through him to this point. But to have a game like that where you have Fulkerson that can have, when he is kind of challenged like that, to where it's like, all right, well, let's see if this guy can beat us, and he can. And, you also get scoring from Justin Powell and Josiah Jordan-James. I think those two guys are the X factors here, to be honest with you. I mean, what you're getting probably out of those top three guys we just talked about. But if Tennessee's going to have, a Final Four type team, it can't necessarily just be those three guys. Like, it has to be those two guys, I think, on the perimeter too, really offering something consistently. And I think those guys are going to be the X factors in terms of how far the Vols can go. But yeah, I mean, that was a big win. That's a really good Arizona team, a really well coached Arizona team with Tommy Lloyd coming from Gonzaga, and that's a huge win for Tennessee. And I think that that's one where you pick up that one and you probably look back and say, man, we probably should have won that game against Texas Tech. They weren't going to win that one against Villanova. But Tennessee's defense also, even without Epons, that was a question we had. How would their defense look? Well, it's looked pretty good thus far, and so. That is pretty good, and you're certainly going to need that defense, I think, going into their showdown too with Alabama next Wednesday.
Well, a couple things that have stood out to me here is their guard play has gotten better in terms of depth. I mean, Santiago Vescovi gives them a second point guard. Sometimes he does run that offense, as you pointed out. Justin Powell from Auburn has given them a really accurate three-point shooter, to the point that Victor Bailey Jr., who led them offensively and scoring a lot of times last year, has kind of taken a back seat. But this is just a really deep team too, Blake.
Yeah, no, I mean, they are. And that's one of the things we talked about, depth going into the season, that, if everyone met expectations, they could go 9-10 deep in terms of the talent that they had on the roster. So, that's something that we'll be able to play to their advantage, I think, moving forward too. And again, help sort of ease some of the pressure off of someone like a Kennedy Chandler, who, as we always say, like, he's still a freshman, and there are going to be some ups and downs, and you kind of see that sometimes with scoring and such. But still, I think everything goes through him. But they need more guys consistently step up if they can get that. Yeah, they'll be right there.
What do you make of Alabama? Because this is a team with 2 wins against Gonzaga and Houston. They're as good as anybody has in the country. But then just 3 head-scratching losses, and I know that happens sometimes, right? It's basketball, and especially November, December basketball, you can see some weird stuff. I still think they've got all the pieces, but just when you think they've lost a game and, okay, they've, quote-unquote, learned their lesson, so to speak. I don't know if it's that simple, but without having better words to put it, I'll describe it that way. And then you look up and say, how did they lose to these guys? What do you make of this team at this point? I mean, it was so consistent a year ago under Nate Oates, and they just befuddle me from night in, night out. You see them beat an elite team, and then you see them lose to a team. They're not losing to awful teams, let's be clear, but they're teams you should be beating when you're knocking off Gonzaga and Houston.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me. I don't think they're very good defensively right now. I think offensively they're not bad, but I think they're actually, you could certainly make the argument that they're just as good or better at times offensively than they were last season. But defensively, I don't think they're as consistent. You can look at the numbers, and I think they sort of speak for themselves in terms of, their 2-point field goal percentage defense. Teams are shooting 51% from 2 against them inside the perimeter. I mean, that's 227th in the country. Something else they're not doing. They're not forcing turnovers. They're 240-something, I think, in the country in turnovers forced. I think they're only turning people over 12 or 13 times a game, which, is something that I think compared to last season, I felt like you saw a lot more of those opportunities that were available to them in those scenarios. And so that is something I think they're struggling with. And we always say, I mean, it's when you play this type of style, the 3-point shot is very important. And, they're not shooting it as well as they did last season. Free throw wise, there are certainly some missed opportunities there in terms of, I think they're shooting 67 or 68% from the line. Those things add up in these close games against good teams. And, it's interesting with Alabama because it's not like you look at them right now and feel like that they're a bad team, because who else has beaten Gonzaga and Houston? Two top 4 KenPom teams. Like, no one else has that good of a pair of wins probably in the country, do they? But yet you lose games to Iona and Memphis and Davidson. And maybe, we say this too. Let's be honest. Like, Iona, Rick Pitino, Davidson, Bob McKillop, like, those are 2 of the best coaches in the country, just from a pure basketball standpoint. So that's always a tough matchup, and those were both close losses. But, I still think that Alabama will figure it out because I think their offense is just to the point still where they can overwhelm people, and that can be the difference in some of these games, as we know. But I just think their defense has to get a little bit better, especially, in some of these close games and crunch time, and be able to get a few more stops and not always have to rely on your offense to sort of carry everything. And if they can do that, I think they'll be fine. I know Nate Oates has kind of made his opinion known, which is not unlike Nate Oates. He's going to tell it like it is, and maybe it's trying to find more of that leadership, find more of that consistency, and if they can do that, I think Alabama will be just fine. But they've kind of hit a stretch here where they're just not playing very well.
Yeah, and just to be clear, because I know we have an audience full of passionate Alabama and Auburn fans, I'm not down on Alabama. In fact, they were my pick preseason to win the league. That was not an easy pick, but I thought they had as good a chance as anybody. Love Nate Oates. Love their freshman point guard. I thought Jaden Shackelford deserved preseason player of the year, which he was our choice there. But it's been not what you expect out of a Nate Oates team. And speaking of not what we expected, LSU 12-0. I don't think anybody had LSU being the last unbeaten standing. Now, you look at their schedule, I don't know that they've beaten any really good teams. They've beaten a lot of decent ones. You look at Belmont, Penn State, Wake Forest, Ohio, Georgia Tech, Louisiana Tech, a lot of decent wins. I don't know that there's a, huge bullet point on the resume in there anywhere, but like you pointed out, that team number 1 in the country in defense. Xavier Pinson, the Missouri transfer, has given them a lot. They are really athletic and run the floor, and just very exciting to watch so far.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is people can talk all they want about the schedule, but they have just overwhelmed teams, and I don't care who you play. If you're winning games the way that they've won games, I've always said that's more impressive to me than, if you're just winning close games against teams that maybe you should beat by 15 or 20. They have just gone out and beaten good teams. We go back to the Belmont game. Belmont's a good team. They beat them by 30. Some of these other teams that are probably going to have a chance to make the NCAA tournament in smaller leagues, like they're beating them too. And their defense speaks for itself. I mean, we would have never thought we'd be saying that LSU is the best defensive team in the country, but they are. And, they deserve credit for that because under Will Wade, they've never been consistent defensively. And now you kind of flip the roster, and clearly when they went out and rebuilt their roster, they realized that they needed to build it around defense. And that's what they've done here. And, bravo to them on that because they have done it masterfully to this point, putting the pieces in place that need to be there for them to have success. I mean, this is still a team that's, for the most part, the chemistry is still coming together. They're still playing guys that are underclassmen in key roles, but they're making it work. And they've got, everything is sort of coming together defensively. And I think right now that defense is going to get challenged over the next couple of weeks when they play Auburn, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and then Florida's in there too. So that's we can say this with LSU. Without looking at the schedule, I don't imagine there's anyone that has a tougher start to the SEC slate than LSU, who goes to Auburn, home games against Kentucky and Tennessee, at Florida, home against Arkansas, at Alabama, at Tennessee. I mean, that's a 7-game stretch right there that I just don't think you're going to find anywhere else from a strength standpoint. So maybe for all the people who don't believe in LSU, you'll be able to say, a lot of things come, mid-January, maybe if they lose a couple of these games somewhere and all of a sudden they start, going backwards. But if they don't, I mean, look out, because they could be Final Four good if they win the games that they have coming up, because this will be undoubtedly the strongest stretch of games they'll have all season over these next 7. And if they come out of there with a winning record from that group, let's say they go 4-3, 5-2, something like that. Yeah, LSU's the real deal, and I still think they're the real deal right now, regardless of who they played.
Blake, we talked preseason about all the great newcomers, and I hate to even start to name them all because I'll slight somebody, but numerous five-star freshmen. We've talked about Jabari Smith at Auburn and his impact. We've talked about Oscar Schwebway at Kentucky and what he's done. I don't know that we ever talked publicly or privately about LSU's Tari Eason in terms of all the impact newcomers, but I think you could maybe argue that he's had as much impact on his team as any newcomer in the league so far.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's always hard to get a grasp on a player when he comes from, another school. And we always say that with transfers, you don't ever know. I mean, you can think something's a slam dunk, but until they get there into that system, you don't ever know for sure. And I think with him, at Cincinnati, good player, but it was Cincinnati, right? Like, it wasn't LSU, and that was as we know, that was a Cincinnati team that struggled a bit, and you just never know what you're going to get when you transfer in. But yeah, I mean, he's been the difference. I mean, you look at how he's played. My goodness, he's been really good. And I mean, he's kind of been the person that's held everything together. He's doing a little bit of everything at this point. When you look at him, I mean, he's scoring, he's rebounding, he's getting steals, he's limiting turnovers. Like, he's doing everything. And so, he's been fun to watch. And I think that, again, now that they get into SEC play, what adjustments do you need to make? And you still certainly got guys like Darius Days and Xavier Pinson. This is where I think LSU, does have an advantage of having Days, who's been in the SEC. Pinson's been in the SEC at Missouri. Like, these guys already understand the territory and what they need to do. So I think that only makes you more optimistic probably about LSU moving forward.
How are we feeling about Florida this morning?
Ask me next week and the week after that. And I mean, I don't know. Like, I think it, I hate to say it, like, it's just, this has probably been the non-conference return that you would expect from Florida at this point. Like, they're 9-3, not a bad record, but you've got one of those losses in there that you shouldn't have. You've got a win in there you probably didn't think you were going to get. And it's just, that's it. Like, I think that's sort of to the point where I don't necessarily know that right now, with Florida, and we've said this over the past couple of seasons, it's after non-conference play, whatever result you have, I think you just kind of throw it out, because you now wait and see, are they going to be able to find consistency in SEC play? If they can, they're good enough. We've said it before. I mean, like you said, they were number 1 in our power rankings a month ago. But can they find that consistency? I don't know. And I just don't know. What do I take away from them beating South Florida and Stony Brook? Not a whole lot. So I think now I think this is a very interesting first game for them, because they're at Ole Miss next Wednesday. And by no means has Ole Miss just been, a juggernaut or anything. But Florida loses that game, like, then I think you really start to wonder, because after that it's Alabama, Auburn, LSU, and those are going to be tough. So I think that's a huge opening game. And I know it doesn't, maybe you're thinking, all right, it's a 30-something game season. First game of the conference play shouldn't be a huge game, but I think it is. I think from a mental standpoint, just from a momentum standpoint, I think Florida's got to win that game, because, like I said, then they got Alabama, Auburn, LSU after that, and I'm not sure they're going to be favored in any of those games. So I think that is a pretty crucial game for them, and maybe that's where we do learn a little bit more about them. But Florida still, I said it going into the season, hard to read. They're right back to where I thought they'd be. I think they're just hard to read right now.
Well, and then you come to the 2 Mississippi schools, as you kind of referenced, and those were both lying out there in the weeds. A lot of people had State as a tournament team, maybe some barely in. I think Blue Ribbon, our buddy Chris Dortch, had them in his top 25. Ole Miss, we just really didn't know. You never bet against Kermit Davis. I don't really know that we know a lot more about those teams, or at least maybe a better way to put it. I don't know that our outlook on either one has really changed since the season begun, at least not from where I sit. What about you?
No, I don't think anything's changed. I mean, we said Mississippi State could be a top half team, and I guess technically right now you kind of look at it, they're in that range. They're right there. I mean, they've got some decent wins. I guess Richmond and teams like Furman, Georgia State, like those are teams that'll have a chance to compete for an NCAA tournament bid. They lose close games to Minnesota and Colorado State, who's very good. We've talked about them. So I don't think anything's changed all that much. Mississippi State will have a chance to get off to a great start in SEC play because they get Arkansas, Missouri, Ole Miss, and Georgia to start things off. I mean, listen, I don't think they go 4-0, but if they did, I wouldn't be shocked because I think that's a pretty favorable stretch to start league play there. Ole Miss, Ole Miss just been inconsistent, and I don't think that was that unexpected. I think we picked them, 10th, 11th, somewhere in there, maybe. Going into the season, I don't know exactly where they fall right now, but it's to me, Ole Miss, just like Florida, teams like that, I still think there's a lot to be determined on them to get a really good grasp of what the identity is probably going to be of this team.
Well, and South Carolina is kind of in there too, right? Because you've got the win over Florida State, but a blowout loss to Coastal Carolina right before that. It seems like we say this over and over for Frank Martin's teams the last few years. There's just no consistency in what they get night in and night out.
Yeah, I think you put them in the same category. I don't think my expectations for South Carolina have changed all that much. I don't remember where we picked them. We probably picked them 11th or 12th, I think. I mean, I'm not saying, that they couldn't finish higher, and maybe they wind up doing that, but again, you base it off of you adjust it based on what you've seen, and thus far, I don't think there's anything significant that makes you think that South Carolina is going to just jump into the NCAA tournament conversation. Although they do have, like we said, some decent wins. Florida State, UAB. I mean, even Wofford's a pretty quality team. Western Kentucky. I mean, those are solid wins, but it's different, than playing Auburn and Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky and all those teams. So. I just, I think how their offense comes along, we'll see. But it can be a grind sometimes, I think, on that side of the floor. I think South Carolina, you just still don't have a really good grasp on what they're going to be. They've got options, but I don't have a good feel on them either. So.
Well, and Texas A&M is kind of in that category. Look, I don't expect the Aggies to be in the top half of the league, but there were a team that you saw picked maybe 12th, 13th by some people. Other people had them maybe 9th, maybe even 8th somewhere. I don't think they got to 8th, but, have not played a tremendously challenging schedule. Did beat Notre Dame. I've watched them at times. It seems like all their games are close. Ken Palm has loved them at times. And again, this is a team where it's just bringing in so many new parts. Is this a team that has a chance to surprise?
I do think Texas A&M is one to kind of keep an eye on because I think you look at them and, we talk about depth and options. Like they're pretty consistent, I think, 1 through 6, 7-ish. And I think that's, again, it's how does that consistency hold up in SEC play? That doesn't always hold up well. And I think that is still something that you have to kind of look and see how they're able to do that. But they're another one that has a pretty favorable schedule to start things off. They got Georgia, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Missouri. Those are 4 winnable games, really, in the grand scheme of things. So maybe that's a chance to build a little momentum. And really, I think you look at their schedule, they have a pretty favorable SEC schedule just based on some of the teams they get twice. They get Georgia twice. They get Missouri, I think, twice, or maybe they'll get Missouri once. But, they have a lot of it. Get Ole Miss twice. That's the one I was thinking of. And so they may actually have a schedule where they can put up some wins, and they've shot the ball pretty well. But I think that they're intriguing. But again, for me, it all starts with SEC play and what do you get there, because they haven't played the most challenging non-conference slate, and so I think it's you're wait and see mode on them too.
Fair to say that the bottom 3 in some order, Vandy, Georgia, Missouri, or would you put any of those teams a little higher up?
I don't think so. I think that's kind of what you expect right now. I think I don't know. I was going to say, I think you can make the case for Vanderbilt at times, but I just haven't seen it yet. And I don't think that's a knock on Vanderbilt. I think it's just, we know they've had players missing, and, when you have 2 of your top players you expect to be starters, not playing, as much to this point. Have been out injured and all that. I think that's just something where I know Chapman came back last night against Hawaii, but first game back, I don't think you read a whole lot into that. So I think you kind of have to wait with Vanderbilt to see how those guys are going to fit in once maybe they're at full strength. But right now, I don't see a whole lot that makes you put them much higher than where they would be. And then Missouri and Georgia, yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I think both of them are going to have a pretty challenging SEC slate. I mean, talked about Georgia beating Memphis. Now they come back and lost to George Mason and East Tennessee State. Again, not bad teams, but you should be beating those teams. And they just are not able to do it. Missouri, I think, is just going to be very up and down probably. I don't see a whole lot of consistency there either.
Yeah, Vandy is the team that I think that's got the best shot to break out of that bunch. But their offense has really gone downhill. I think Scottie Pippen Jr. can't carry them. They don't have enough parts around them. Chapman's actually been back for 2 games now, played limited minutes, and I think started against Hawaii last night. And by the way, they beat Hawaii out in Hawaii, but that game was closer than it needed to be late. And I think Hawaii had 3 or 4 starters out with COVID too, off a team that's not that good to begin with. I just see Vanderbilt having a lot of struggles offensively. Frankly, I don't think this team breaks out of that pack unless it gets Liam Robbins back. I think he might be out of the boot now. He led the Big Ten in block shots. But really, even if they get him back, Blake, it's not defense where he probably helps them the most. I mean, frankly, he does help them offensively, and that probably does open up the floor a lot. But they don't have enough shooters, and if they don't get him back healthy and productive, I think it's going to be another first day of the tournament showing for them, which they can't seem to get out of that level now for several years. I think that it all depends for Vanderbilt on whether Liam Robbins comes back, because I think if he doesn't, they're kind of cooked.
Yeah, I think we thought the ceiling for them was probably absolute best case scenario. I think we would have said 8th probably in the SEC.
Yeah, and maybe more like 9th or 10th. But
that's
yes,
what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That I think our best case scenario was 8th, and that was if absolutely everything went right. But we did say the most likely ceiling is probably 9th or so, I think, for them. And so, that's right now, just based on what we've seen thus far, I don't think you're changing your prediction on that all that much.
Yeah, Missouri and Georgia, I just don't see a lot of hope this year. Missouri just got throttled by Illinois in a game that was over not long after it started. We've seen that a couple times with the Tigers. They got a couple transfers, but they're just, on the lower end of talent in this league. And same with Georgia. Georgia's had some surprises. I just don't think they've got enough there.
No, I mean, Missouri's 355th in the country. 3-point percenters are shooting 24.3% from 3. It's hard to win in this era if you don't have some sort of 3-point attack, and they don't. So I think it's just hard because, yes, there are some teams that are terrible at the 3, but they are probably, exceeding at the 2s, and Missouri's not really exceeding in either one of them. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, for this team.
Blake, I feel like we've hit everybody. Any parting thoughts or themes we didn't touch on today that are worth mentioning?
Well, you're going to make one fan base mad because we have not mentioned them, and that is Arkansas.
Good grief. That was not intentional. Let's talk about Arkansas.
But I'm just kidding. We didn't do that intentionally. Actually, I think it's good that we saved Arkansas for last because I think they've been the most I don't know, like they've been the team. I don't want to say the most talked about team, but I think they've been the most interesting team from the standpoint of where they were coming into the season, where some people thought they would be, and then where other people thought they would be at this point in the season. And I think they maybe, I don't know if polarizing is the right word, but they have been a team that there's been a lot of debate about. And really, I honestly think they may be, the most debated team at this point because they did have that hot start at 9-0. You and I talked about them. I kept saying, I always say this, I'm not saying anything to try to be right. I'm just telling you what I see. And I just kept saying, I think there's just something missing with this team. And I don't know what it is. Even when they're sitting there at 9-0, I just still think there's something that's not quite there with them. And then they lose the back-to-back games to Oklahoma and Hofstra. The Hofstra one, certainly more, of a disappointment than the Oklahoma one, even though they lost that Oklahoma one by 20-something. But I don't know what it is still. Like, I don't. And maybe some people think that they know exactly what it is, that this team is, and we can bring up what we brought up before, Moses Moody and Justin Smith, those guys, what they did last year. You don't have those elements, I don't think, on this team. And we're not even talking about the specific we're not talking about that specific player. We're talking about what they brought to the rotation. I just don't know what it is, but there's still something that I look at this team and I'm thinking, I just don't know if they have that next gear. And, they're not as good of a 3-point shooting team. They're another one that struggled. They're shooting, 30% or something from three, 31%, something like that. They're not doing well on the perimeter defensively. Like, they're giving up some threes, I think. Quite a few of them, I guess, if you look at sort of the numbers. But I still think that they are an NCAA tournament team. I just don't think they're a team right now. That can change. And I've told you, right, like we've talked about this, no one, I would be willing to bet no one has a better first half of the SEC schedule than Arkansas. They may rack up a lot of wins here early. The back half, though, is extremely challenging. And I think maybe, like we said, maybe that actually works in Arkansas's favor, because if it was flipped and you play that tougher part of the schedule early for a team that is clearly still trying to figure some things out, that can maybe do more harm than good. But because they have a chance to sort of ease into things, because really, I mean, let's think about this. Let's go through this. At Mississippi State, that's going to be challenging. Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, Missouri, LSU, that's tough, of course. South Carolina, A&M again, Ole Miss. Like, and then after that, Georgia, Mississippi State. Like, those are all teams that right now you're probably projecting outside of LSU to not make the NCAA tournament. So
yeah. Look, it's not easy, but it's a far cry from what it could be and what it is for some of these other teams, and maybe that ends up being a gift for them as they figure it. And look, you and I have done podcasts together for many years before the 14 was even around. And your Arkansas barometer has always been right on. I remember you and I talking, I think the night they played Mercer, and really struggled with that one more than they should have. And you called it right away. You said, this team is just lacking something. I think it's probably a post presence somewhere, because, look, it's not scoring. I mean, J.D. Note and Chris Likes have given them offensively what we thought they would. But you look at them, and it's not your step on the neck Arkansas team like we've seen at times under Eric Musselman. I'm with you. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not been there yet. And I wouldn't rule out that it comes, but right now it's just not there. And you have called this literally from opening night.
Well, and it is a very guard-heavy team. But I say that to say that, some of Muss's better teams he's had in his career, whether that's at Nevada or, like, he's had some teams that have been heavy with guards, and it's worked out. But and look, like I said, there are probably others who can kind of pinpoint what that is by now. I still have not pinpointed necessarily what that is. I think it's probably a variety of things. I don't think it's just one thing. But I think that this team, you can game plan for this Arkansas team a little bit differently than you could the one last year. To where I think it was, and this is not to say that I think it's easy to game plan for this Arkansas team, because, like you said, you got J.D. Note out there who can certainly score at any time. You've got Likes and Tony and Davis and all those guys. I just think it's a different approach, and for some reason, that is allowing teams, I think, to find some success, even if they're not beating them. I just think that it's making some of these games closer than maybe perhaps you expected, and that certainly has something to do. And let's point this out too. We talk about teams. Alabama's not as good defensively as they were last year. Arkansas is not as good defensively as they were last year. That's something else to keep in mind, I think, with this. And that's where I think having a Moses Moody and Justin Smith, like, because of what they could bring on that side too, there's something to that. And so it's going to be interesting, because I do think there is a scenario where we're having the same discussion a month from now, because Arkansas may be sitting there at 7-1 in SEC play. And they may be sitting there at 17-3 overall. But yet we may still be looking at it and saying, I know Arkansas is 17-3, but do we think that are they still, are they where we think they should be, or do we think they're a Final Four team at 17-3? It's wild to think about, but I think this next month is going to tell us a lot about Arkansas because they do have a lot of winnable games in here, even though some of them are on the road. And like you mentioned, it's not to say that this is going to be easy because there are road games in there, and there are quite a few. But if they come out of this, 7-1 or something, then I think if you're an Arkansas fan, you're feeling pretty good because even going into that back half of the schedule, you would have built up more confidence, more momentum than you would have, like we said, if it was in reverse. Where I think right now, if they had to play their back half of the schedule right now, if it was flipped, I think then you'd really start to say, like this team is going to spiral because I think it would be very challenging for them to pull off a lot of wins with that back half of the schedule. Whereas right now, I think they can, pick up wins against teams like Vanderbilt and A&M and Missouri and Carolina and those kind of teams. So,
any other parting thoughts on the SEC, Blake?
No, that's we covered it pretty much all, and I think that SEC play starts next week, and that will certainly start to give us better insight into where these teams stand.
Okay, I'm going to give you a little nugget, for lack of a better term, that I heard last night on an ESPN broadcast, and this really hadn't occurred to me until it was said out loud. And this to me is probably the astonishing, it's not a stat, but maybe the astonishing fact of the year so far in college basketball. We are about to head into January, and the ACC's got one team ranked. That's Duke at number 2. That to me is incredible.
Yeah, it's ACC is a struggle. I think you could make the argument that of those, Power 6 or whatever you want to call it, I don't care what the power, whatever, they could be the worst of that group. I think the Pac-12 has been good. I don't know how good they are overall, but the ACC is going to be a struggle. I think what was the stat about Duke not having a ranked team or something on their schedule the rest of, I don't remember exactly what it is.
Oh my goodness, that's crazy. Yeah, but I mean I think that would have to be true at this point because you don't play that much outside your league.
I think right now maybe that was what it was because I'm looking down. I'm like, all right, Clemson's not ranked, are they? Florida State, Carolina's not. Yeah, right now they don't have a ranked team. They're going to play the rest of the year. So I know obviously we would expect that to change. Someone probably sneaks in there at some point. But as of right now, 12 games in, you don't have a ranked team the rest of the way. Very interesting. So maybe Duke's that team goes into March ACC tournament at 28-1 or something, and we're like, wait a second, is Duke still that good? No, they are that good, by the way. I'm just joking.
Yeah, I agree. Banchero is boy. That you talk about number 1 pick. That kid may be right up there with Jabari Smith.
Yeah, Duke's good, but I think that brings up a bigger discussion on like where the SEC sits in terms of strength of conferences. I still think you're probably putting them behind the Big 12. I think there was an opportunity a couple weeks ago for if you don't have some of those games that Arkansas doesn't lose to Hofstra, Florida doesn't lose to Texas Southern, and those kind of games, Alabama doesn't lose a couple of those games. I think then you can really make a strong case maybe, but because you've had some of these teams drop some of these non-conference games maybe that they shouldn't have, you're still going to put the Big 12 at the top. I don't think that's changing no matter what. And I still think the Big 10's pretty good. So but still the SEC has a chance to be stronger, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, Oreo is very fired up about all this, as I'm sure you have heard all podcast.
Yes.
But my apologies for that. But yeah, I mean, a couple weeks ago, Blake, you looked at Ken Palm's strength of conference ratings, and you had the big, I think it was Big 12, Big 10, may have been the other order, I'm not sure, and I don't have it in front of me at the moment. But you had the SEC not really far behind them in terms of numbers, and they had that little stretch where, as you said, they take care of business against the Hofstras and the Texas Southerns and some of those teams. The SEC got a shot to even leapfrog one of those two teams, but Ken Palm is right now showing there's a little bit bigger gap between those leagues than there was a couple weeks ago, and I don't think that's unfair. I mean, the SEC, come on, you guys, you got to take care of business. We think you're a good league, tons of good players, exciting conference races, lots of good teams, 4 or 5 potentially great teams, but they really just missed their opportunities to kind of shut the door and make this a real conversation about who the best league is right now. But right now, I do think they're third, and it's, I don't know. This is the point where they could have made that argument because now they just turn to playing each other. Well, I take that back. You got the SEC Big 12 challenge. That's an opportunity to close the gap there, and maybe you see it. But I really look at, if you say there's one thing that's disappointing about the SEC this year, it's that window where they just drop some of these games where you and I just texting each other every night, just scratching our heads going, how did that happen?
Yeah, it seems like that happens a lot. And I think that is, I said it earlier, I think that is just a product of the changing face of college basketball. I think it's just, you are in an era now where there are so many other teams outside of these power conferences that are quality teams that I don't think will get enough credit because you're going to have fan bases and power conferences that are still always going to look at some of these teams as like, oh, it's just Davidson, right? Like it's, but. And that's not, again, I'm not saying that Alabama should have lost that game, but it's that kind of scenario where I think you're always going to see that because you and I always laugh about this, right? Like it's everyone, the rival fan base always becomes the biggest, most knowledgeable person of the team that beats their most hated rival, right? Like we've watched this team play the entire year. I always think that's kind of funny. So that's what I think when you make those arguments about when you do have teams from these mid-major conferences or whatever that beat some of these teams in power conferences, and we're not just talking about the SEC, we're talking about elsewhere too. I think sometimes we put way too much on what's wrong with the teams at the top of that pecking order, the power conference teams, instead of wait a second, like some of these mid-major teams or teams in lower conferences may actually be pretty darn good. And I think that's always been a sort of dynamic that I think is flipped way too much when sometimes I think it may just be, hey, maybe the other team's going to actually have a pretty good season. And sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But I think we always tend to do that. We always try to find what's wrong with a team that, is on that higher level versus, wait a second, like maybe that team that beat them is actually a pretty good team. So, yeah, I think that's always an interesting discussion.
Yeah, and I think there's still a football mentality in this league, right? Like, in football, the better team wins the game most of the time, especially if they're significantly better. Basketball is a stuff happens league, right? And I
way
think
different.
You've still got some fan bases that are more football oriented. That maybe you've got the nuanced fans at the top who understand that, but maybe some that don't. And I don't think either you and I are a whole lot less bullish on the league than we were coming in. In fact, I look at some of the guys and some of the players in this league, and again, I hate to keep singling out Jabari Smith, but he's one that we said potential lottery pick coming in, but how does it pan out? Well, so far it's panning out. So many of these transfers, like is it Kellen Grady, a guy that we said early on, it's not working out like we thought it would, but now that's starting to change. I mean, these teams are still very much in the formative state, and I'm not any less bullish on the talent. I think we kind of hold these teams to high standards ourselves because we know how good these coaches are. We know how good the talent is. And so I think some of us tend to, you may hear us criticize your team at times. That's not that we're down on them. We know what these guys are capable of. I'll give you another example. I had a buddy of mine that really follows SEC basketball sent me a text last night saying, boy, the bottom of this league is really bad. And I said, well, wait a minute. You tell me a team or a league in the country, I don't care who it is, where you name the bottom 2 or 3 teams in the league and go, man, that's an NCAA tournament team. That's the nature of any league anywhere. I don't even think that the bottom teams in this league are awful teams. Now, maybe Vandy, Georgia, Missouri end up there, but Vandy's got the preseason player of the year in Scottie Pippen Jr. and hasn't been at full strength. Georgia's pulled an upset of Memphis. South Carolina has pulled an upset of Florida State. Missouri has had some good games in there at times. I mean, even when people criticize the bottom of the league, I go, you still got some things there to hang your hat on a little bit for some of those teams.
Yeah, it's always a funny discussion because like you did bring up something that I always laugh at about. It's like at the end of the year, you'll have people that are like, man, the bottom of the conference just sucked this year. Well, I mean, listen,
name a league where that doesn't happen, right?
I love soccer. I love Ted Lasso. But, it's like, there are no draws. Like, somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. Like, it's just it's basketball. So it's just like one of those things where, okay, well, man, those teams at the bottom were bad. they lost, more than half their games. Well, yeah, because they played another team in the conference, and there's no somebody had to win and somebody had to lose. So yeah, and like we say, we're saying this tongue in cheek because there are going to be some bad teams every year, right? Like there are going to be like we said. I mean, Georgia's not a good team, and we've seen some Vanderbilt teams, as we know, in recent years that have not been very good. Other teams towards the bottom, but at the same time, it's like I think I just do, and I don't know if it's just the social media era where there's not a reason filter on Twitter where you can just filter out all reasonable tweets. That's something that I wish I could invent, but it doesn't exist, and so you're always going to see, I think, the focus on the negative, and we understand how media works and all that. You're gonna accentuate the negative stuff versus focusing on, all right, well, instead of us talking about how bad the bottom of the league is, what about that top of the league? All those teams that beat those teams at the bottom, what about those teams? I think they're actually pretty good. So, yes, it's always a fun discussion, and we always do it. I find it entertaining. Again, we don't take ourselves too seriously, and I think that is something that we try to use as perspective as we go throughout the season.
I wonder how differently we would process results. Let's say if we lived in another time, Twitter and social media lends itself to hot takes, if nothing else. Like, what if we didn't know anything for 2 weeks? And like we get this batch in over the Telegram or whatever. It says, oh, Arkansas had 5 games. And by the way, these are how those games played out, the good, bad, and the ugly. I do wonder how much just the nature of media these days filters how we look at teams. I mean, I know it does.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's that's a big discussion. We could have our own multi-hour podcast on that, probably, about just how teams are perceived. And I do think there's another discussion that, again, we could have a multi-hour podcast on. I think there is a tendency sometimes to go, because we do have all of this stuff available to us, all the resources, all the data, the hard data on teams. I think there is a tendency sometimes to go so far into the data that it doesn't always necessarily paint the entire picture, because there's always going to be sort of missing elements, I think, that can't always be explained just from numbers and the data and that kind of stuff. So I think that's something that plays into it too, especially when you're trying to compare conferences or compare teams. And like we said, if you're having the discussion about, well, man, that team was terrible. All right. Well, does the data show that team was missing, their best player for 14 games? That's just those kind of things that I think that you always have to have. And like you said on Twitter, it's a very black and white discussion. There is no middle ground, as we know. It is the ultimate. If you want sort of that little gray area on Twitter, good luck, because you're not finding it anywhere. So,
well, and one more thing, you talked about players missing. I hope to God we are not having this discussion about COVID costing teams players again.
Well,
I'm over it. We need to be beyond it. It has hit other leagues. I don't know that it's hit the SEC that hard yet, but that's the other thing that's just going to make this so complicated is we're going to have a hard time if this becomes a thing again, looking back and going, okay, well, they beat Kentucky or name a team. I'm just the first one that comes to mind is Kentucky. Well, who did they have then? Were they without this guy or that guy? I hope to God we don't have that, because there's already a lot to digest, and the last thing I want is having to go back and look at who had who when it beat this team or lost to this team.
Well, and I, like you said, we've gone through this whole podcast and I've not mentioned that, but I do tend to think there is going to be a possible scenario like that, because, we're getting into the Christmas holiday and, we understand like gatherings and all. Like, I think there was a story that came out. What was it? I think it was on Wednesday, about the SEC was going to review, its policies about games canceled and all that. And I think that wasn't just basketball. That was just the entire thing. Because, of course, as we know, like there's pretty big college football games coming up here not too far away. And I think, the ridiculous part, what was it? Was it the Big East where you had forfeits, games being forfeited or something? Because I think that they officially eliminated that. So at first they had that sort of set where the Big East, where if you didn't have enough players to play, you had to forfeit games. And of course, how ridiculous is that? When it's just like, if this is completely out of these players' control, like how are you forcing forfeits on the teams? I never understood that from the start, but I do think the Big East has changed that since. But I can't imagine a scenario where the SEC is going to implement any sort of forfeits unless there is just something absolutely preventable that causes the team to, not have enough players or to have to actually forfeit the game and not be able to play. I'm with you. I hope there's not a scenario where you're just seeing a lot of reshuffling of games being lost for certain teams, and then you do. Then that makes the comparison much harder, which, as we know, last season was just almost impossible to do in terms of just how things played out. And, of course, the season is just very wild. So,
Blake, thanks for joining us. That's a fun show. And the longer I do this, I'm just sitting here thinking I can't wait to talk about what's ahead in the SEC, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, it should be a fun conference season. And it all gets started next Wednesday.
All right, he's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thank you for listening to our show today at the 14.